It is Friday, and that means it's Tournament Tactician time here for Legends of Runeterra. We're going to be going over the first tier list that I'm dropping since the World Championship has ended, and of course we'll have some influences upon that. There is no online league series this weekend. The tournament organizer had to step away for a week, take care of some personal stuff. We should be back on board next weekend. So what do you actually have going on this weekend? For the America Shard, we have a Mastering Runeterra podcast tournament. They will be doing a European one next weekend in order to avoid a confliction with European Masters this weekend so that everyone can join in. And then the Americas will be having the OLS next weekend. So everything works out really nice there. And then the weekend after that, that'll be October 8th and 9th. That'll be the seasonal. The Beyond the Vandalwood seasonal tournament. So that'll be really fun. We're raring up for it. We've got a couple tournaments left. And then we kick off the 2022 season. So let's take a look at what the end of the 2021 season looks like. All right, so technically this isn't the end of the 2021 season. This is the start of the 2022 season, but I feel like I nailed the intro, so just keep it to yourself, all right? So let's go over the tier list that I have prepared. This is the first one that we're looking at in a post-Worlds world, and we've got a lot of decks in tier 1, and this is kind of expected. We knew that the format was very open. We knew that the meta was pretty healthy. Looking forward to the seasonal. It feels like there's at least one or two new decks coming out every week. This week, the new deck is the Ziggs Poppy Noxus Burn deck, which we'll get into a little bit later. But for now, I feel like I looked back at what I had thought pre-Worlds, and I had to look back all the way to the start of the meta when I said that Control I felt like was going to do very well, and now it feels like that has finally come to fruition. I am finally right on what I had said. It seems I was just looking a little bit too far forward. Darkness obviously had a very strong performance at Worlds and has since picked up a big presence on ladder. It's got good matchups into a lot of the good decks and all that kind of stuff. We're going to keep it kind of light and breezy this week, get a little bit more in-depth right before the seasonal because that is approaching. I'm sure things will change between now and then, so I don't want to go super in-depth on a tier list that isn't going to last, but what I do want to say is I am back on the Control train. I think that Field of Rush was a very smart adaptation from Shihu. I think we're going to continue to see that propel itself into the meta and just continue to do very well. Obviously, Nami is one of the boogeymen of the meta. Poppy Rally isn't going anywhere. Important to note that there are a lot of Poppy decks running around. I still think that Poppy Rally and Bandletree are two of your better options. Both of them do pretty well into Control, which is something that I think we'll continue to see. And Bandletree, while it fell off for a bit, I think it was just kind of a fluke that it fell off so hard at the World Championship specifically, and it'll start to ramp back up in more of the community tournaments. Draven Scion has overtaken Draven Caitlyn and Draven Ezreal because in this controlier meta, Draven Caitlyn and Draven Ezreal can get pretty outgrinded. You know, in theory, you have Lost Souls, so you're never getting outgrinded, but you don't do as well as you would want to into something like Darkness. Not that Draven Scion does much better, but there are definitely a lot of real control decks that just outgrind these Noxus control decks. TF Swain, TF GP runs into a similar problem, where a Shadow Isle Freljord control deck is going to beat you most of the time because your tempo doesn't mean enough against them that they can't just clear your board with one sweeper. Draven Ezreal, Draven Caitlyn do a little bit better of, you know, dealing with getting out tempoed with the Lost Souls and all that kind of things. Maybe you can sneak through a little bit of damage, but overall it feels very one-sided for the Shadow Isle player most of the time when you're taking a Shadow Isle control deck up against an Noxus control deck, and that's why Draven Scion's probably going to continue to overtake Draven Caitlyn. Draven Scion also had a very high ban presence, while Draven Caitlyn was allowed to play a little bit more, and I think that players are just going to continue to lean into the Scion way of doing things, at least for the time being. And then Shellfolk Ezreal, a new addition to Tier 1. This shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone. It's probably one of the best Ezreal decks out there. I think it's going to do very well into a lot of decks in the meta. Obviously, Alan only got to play it once at Worlds. It hasn't really picked up popularity on ladder, but I've seen a lot of the Karma Ezreal players start to gravitate towards this, and with those being some of the best players in Legends of Runeterra, some, you know, the people that tend to lean towards the combo decks, a lot of the old MTG players that have performed very well in that game, those kinds of players really gravitate towards something like the Shellfolk Ezreal. I think it's got a good matchup spread across the board, and will probably not have a super high play rate, but I imagine it'll put a few people into the top cut. I'm really big on this deck. I think a lot of the community is really big on this deck, and I think that the power level is there that we can call it Tier 1 at least for sort of its debut weekend into the community tournaments. Tier 2 is uncharacteristically small, but hey, it is what it is. I still think that Thralls is well positioned into the meta. This has been sort of my wild card pick for a little while now. I've been big on Thralls this meta. I'm still big on Thralls. It does pretty well into Control. It's kind of labeled as a combo deck, which is a little disingenuous. What I mean is it is a deck that has a combo that it can do by I mean, its combo is get 2 Thralls out on turn 5 or turn 6, right? If you don't do that, your deck isn't functioning as well as you want it to, but if you do get to do that, which happens, you know, a decent amount of the time, then you just snowball a lot of matchups. And because there's not a lot of landmark interaction, and that's why Bandletree gets to do so well, I still think Thralls is pretty well positioned. I think that they get to play defensively enough against something like Draven Scion and the Rally decks because of the Frostbite that is available, because of the Avalanches that are available, and Thralls is still just my sleeper pick, and I still think it is high enough power level to sit in tier 2. Draven Caitlyn said my piece on Anivia is just kind of a worse field rush. I don't actually remember how the FTR Anivia head-to-head goes, but that could be a reason for players to move over to the Anivia rather than stick on to the Fielder Rush. The things that answer Fielder Rush don't answer Anivia as well, so that's kind of where players are going to be split on it. I think that Fielder Rush, having that game-ending power, is more valuable than what Anivia brings to the table, but I think both decks are going to perform pretty well. I would expect Fielder Rush to show up in the top 8 this weekend. Anivia is a little bit more of a wild card in that regard. It's possible that players just don't pick up on it, but we'll figure that out a little bit later. And then Plunder and Ping City. Just sort of the Gangplank decks of the meta. I feel like these are both relatively similar in power level. They do relatively different things, and I think that Ping City is almost... you know, you could classify this as an aggro deck, especially if you're going to look at Plunder and say, hey, this is a mid-range deck, and Plunder, I think, is very much like quintessential mid-range. And then you look at Ping City, it's not the same archetype, right? You've all seen Ping City, GPPC, whatever you want to call it, Bandle Pirates. I think it's pretty good. I'm not as big on it as I was before the World Championship. I think the builds are just shy of being there. I think there's still a little bit of oomph that people need to put this over the top, and then, you know, maybe then we'll get to see this rise up a little bit. But honestly, I'm just like not huge on aggro right now. Rally is kind of the exception because it does get to play cards like Ranger's Resolve, but any burn type strategy I'm a little iffy on. Yes, it's got a place in the meta. Yes, it's on the tier list for a reason. It very much can top a tournament. I'm just not very big on it. I think that you have a lot of potential to get outraced. You probably don't get down as much unit damage as you need to for the burn to actually finish someone off, and if Control and Shadow Isle in general is coming back in a relatively larger fashion, then I think that there's going to be enough healing in the meta that it's kind of iffy to bring a triple aggro lineup. I don't think we're going to see any triple aggro this weekend. I would expect a fair amount of double aggro, maybe something like Ping City plus Ziggs Poppy plus whatever, and kind of go from there. But I do not think we're going to see people just go in triple aggro trying to pick on the Nami or something like that, like kind of like we saw out of Pin Ping Ho, but again, that was only a double aggro lineup, and then Sivir Demacia kind of running it out. That's what I expect out of aggro this weekend, is you take your 2 aggressively postured decks, and then you find like an aggressively postured mid-range deck to round out the lineup. I don't think we're going all in on a triple burn strategy. TF Noxus didn't do hot at Worlds at all, and same complaints I had with Draven Caitlyn. You are a Noxus control deck that is getting outgrinded by pretty much every other kind of control deck, which is something that players are once again big on. So hey, sorry, TF Noxus, it's not looking great for you. Gangplank, this is probably just like one of the worst Gangplank decks. Wait, no, Pirate aggro is probably the worst Gangplank deck. Discard aggro down here as well. Ziggs Poppy is something that's been taking over ladder lately. It hasn't really made a tournament debut yet. It's been played a little bit in EU Masters, though generally Ziggs Poppy has... I feel like Ziggs Poppy has been used more as a bait to play a Bandletree deck than it has to actually be a Ziggs Poppy deck in EU Masters at least, but that's a totally different format. I'm not letting that influence the tier list at all. But essentially, we're just kind of getting into this realm of putting Bandle City Mayor and Poppy in a lot of different decks and then figuring out what kind of shell we can make around it. And the Burn Shell is the newest thing that we're experimenting with. Fizzly is another deck that has popped up on ladder. I'm not optimistic for this. It's a really weird looking list, but players have been piloting it and finding success with it. Some of them are more confused about it than others, but this is something that you very well could run into. I don't think you're going to see it too much, though. Again, Lee Sin, still on the tier list. I trimmed a lot of things off the tier list. Lee Sin, going to stay. I still think this deck is one of those things that you need to be cognizant of. Like, if you forget that Lee Sin exists, you're going to lose to Lee Sin. And then Lurk and Frostbite midrange kind of rounding things out as like some counter picks. Lurk, a good counter to, I believe, Nami Elusives. I think Lurk has like a 60 or 70% win rate. And then Frostbite midrange, the counter to Scion. So what are we expecting out of lineups this weekend? I don't really want to like get into, hey, here are the decks, here are the matchups. I just gave you like a quick brief overview, why are the decks tiered where they are. And now I want to talk about lineup composition. Yeah, I don't know what fucking nugget of wisdom you thought I was going to be able to give you on lineup composition. Do you see how many tier 1 decks there are? It's all personal preference. People could run anything. There are players like me that are not super big on Nami Elusives and would not want to run this in their lineup. Nami is something that, like, you need to respect, right? Because if you don't ban it, then your opponent's going to high roll on it. But if you try to play it, then you're going to low roll on it. Wink, wink. One of those kind of decks, right? So I'm not super big on the Nami. The Poppy Rally decks have really been kind of mediocre so far. I think it had like a 50% win rate at Worlds over 20 matches. Historically, Poppy Rally doesn't have super impressive tournament results, and I don't know that it is a better Poppy deck than something like Bandletree. But again, Poppy Bandle City Mayor is just a package that players are experimenting with all over the place right now in a lot of different capacities. If I were playing this weekend, my lineup would probably be Feel the Rush, Draven Scion, and then I'd kind of decide between Bandletree or Thralls. It's not a well-rounded lineup. I didn't really put any thought into sort of the composition of it, shared weaknesses, ban strategy, anything like that. I just kind of picked my comfort decks. And as we get closer and closer to the seasonal, it is important for you to look at a list like this and figure out what your comfort decks are. And then, find ideally like 5 of them, and then start to narrow the list down into shared weaknesses and start to actually craft a lineup out of it rather than just the 3 decks that I'm most comfortable on. You can succeed with the 3 decks you're most comfortable on, but it's a little bit better if you're comfortable on something that has and makes sense as a lineup. So that's kind of what I want to see players doing this week and next week especially, is just figuring out in this really open meta that doesn't seem to be showing any signs of closing anytime soon, you just got to play comfort. And you need to figure out which of like the heavy hitters of the meta, like Draven Scion or Nami Elusives, or which Poppy deck are you going to play, Sivir, Demacia, which of these decks are you big on, which ones click with your play style, which ones do you think suck that you could potentially leave open and just call your opponent's bluff. Because I caught found a fair amount of success just saying, hey, I don't think Nami's that good, leaves Nami open through the qualifiers, bodies it, and players just kind of fumbled on the deck. And I don't think that's something that's getting solved anytime soon. I think Nami Elusives is a lot more swingy than players want to admit in some circles. And I think like most people are on board with the fact that like Nami Elusives is a very swingy deck, and it's very scary to like bring this to a tournament, and it's also scary to leave open. But what you should be doing is like look at tier 1, maybe dig a little bit into tier 2, dig deep into tier 3 if you're just hell-bent on proving me wrong, or if those are one of your comfort decks, because again, if I don't think a deck can win a tournament, it's not on the tier list. The decks in tier 3 are still very much viable. So just figure out what your decks are, play them on ladder a little bit, just grab 3 random decks this weekend, gung-ho for it. You've got next weekend at the Online League Series to maybe put a little bit more polish on it and figure things out. But yeah, that's kind of, the post-Worlds tier list. Nothing too crazy. I think a lot of this makes sense to most people that are going to be watching, right? Tier 1's getting a little crowded, but hey, that just kind of is the nature of it. I think we're very far away from having anything be tier 0. So, tier 1's feeling a little bit bigger than I want it to be, but I think that's more indicative of the meta and something that I need to reflect on the tier list rather than just like limiting the amount of decks that I can put in tier 1. So, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.